So, guys, today we're going to be talking about chapter 6, section 3, and it's just called The Rise of Christianity. And this religion began in the Roman province of Judea, which was once known as the state of Israel. But by the time of Caesar Augustus, this was a province. It was an occupied territory by the Roman government. And so, again, that's why it fits into this discussion. And so, after the death of Jesus, as the religion began to grow and spread, it spread particularly quickly among the Roman Empire. So a little background. If you're familiar with the Christmas story, which is in the Gospels and in the book of Luke chapter 2, it begins by saying, in those days Caesar declared that the world should be taxed. And it's a reference to Caesar Augustus, and it is part of the Christmas story because at the time of Jesus, Judea was a province of Rome. It had been conquered and made part of the Roman Empire in about the year 6 of the Common Era, or Latin Anno Domini, which just means year of our Lord. So, not all, but many Jewish people in that Roman province believed that he was the Messiah, that he was the promised one that had been written about from the prophets, and that he would free them. And, there were lots of different interpretations of what the prophets were getting at with this. For example, if you read the book of Isaiah, chapter 52, it speaks of this coming Messiah. And many people thought that this Messiah would set them free from the Roman occupation. But this man was born a carpenter in Bethlehem, raised in Nazareth, and began his ministry at the age of 30, teaching monotheism, teaching the Ten Commandments, teaching some really radical ideas for the time. For example, to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, to love everyone, and even the concept that he was God on earth. And so there was some disagreement about, what was this Messiah? Because there had actually been many people claiming to be the Messiah, both before Jesus and after Jesus. And so there was some contention there. Now, according to the Gospels, he performed many miracles, and which, by the way, the Gospels, the book of Mark was the first one, and it was written about 50 years after the death of Jesus. So these are all accounts based on oral tradition, meaning people had been telling these stories. But the main theme of his message was this personal relationship with God, that one could actually know their Creator. And so you've probably heard of some of these miracles that are told in this story, of healing the blind man, of raising Lazarus from the dead, of healing the sick, of, one of his more famous miracles was the feeding of the 5,000. And, with very small amounts of food, he multiplied the food. Again, I'm sure you've heard of many of these stories, but Now, according to the Gospels, again, this is the primary source for our understanding about Christianity. The only other contemporary non-canonical source was a Roman historian named Josephus, and he made reference to a man from Judea called Jesus, but that's about all he said about them. There were some other non-canonical works that had been parts of various religious collections, but during the Council of Nicaea, this Roman council decided not to include them. So like the Gospels of Mary Magdalene, the Book of Enoch, and so forth. But again, the main part of the story that you're so familiar with is coming from these four Gospels. So there were 12 disciples. Also, the Greek word for this is apostle, which just means to go or to travel. And these were his closest followers. And part of his message, which was considered very revolutionary for its time, was that one should ignore wealth and status. He even went so far as to say it's very difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And you've probably heard the phrase, he said, it's easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than it is for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's talking about, and it's a concept that you'll see in several different religions. Hinduism and Buddhism particularly emphasize this. You'll find these teachings in Islam as well. And it's a concept called aestheticism. It's the idea that poverty and suffering make you closer to the divine. And so Jesus certainly taught that, and you'll see that in these other religions as we begin to study them. Now, according to the Gospels, many of Jesus' own people, the Jews, particularly from two various sects, SECTS, or divisions within Judaism. The two denominations were, one, the Pharisees, and two, the Sadducees. And both groups were leaders in the Jewish community, and they sought for his execution.
Okay.
So, why did they seek this? Well, part of it was the revolutionary nature of his teachings, and part of it had to do with his emphasis on simplicity or asceticism or poverty. And many of these leaders in the Jewish community had become wealthy because of their status and because of their position. And he discouraged that type of lifestyle. So anyway, he made a share of enemies. Now, to bring charges against him, they had to bring him to the Roman governor because, well, it was a province of Rome. So that made the people of Judea effectively Roman citizens. Now, the leaders of the Jewish community brought him before the governor, whose name was Pontius Pilate, and and there Pilate questioned him, trying to figure out, what did this guy do? You know, he wasn't just going to execute anyone without good reason. And so,
Just too amazing.
yeah, so at the end of their conversation, one phrase has always stuck with me, where Jesus said, I am the truth. And then Pilate responded by saying, what is truth? What is that even? And at the end of the conversation, Pilate just decided, okay, these Jewish people are going to be mad at me if I don't go through with it. So he ordered his crucifixion. And, I'm sure you know the rest of the story, that according to the Gospels, his followers believe that he rose from the dead 3 days afterwards, and that he continued a ministry for about 42 days and then ascended into heaven. And as a result of this miracle, people began to refer to him as the Christ, which is a Greek word also meaning Christos, or the anointed one. And so you may hear it translated as Savior, and this is just the beginning of the religion of Christianity. So now let's begin to think about how it grew and how it spread. So Jesus' followers began to spread the message of the arrival of God on earth and the crucifixion and the ascension. And the significance of this is what they called, a sacrifice, a sacrifice on behalf of mankind, as part of a redemption for people's sins. So this message began to spread throughout the Roman Empire, particularly because of a later apostle. Now, Paul never actually met Jesus during his ministry. In fact, he was an adult much later. And according to his story, he was traveling, I believe, to a place called Tarsus. And don't quote me on that, but he was traveling to a certain city-state, seeking to persecute people of this new faith. He was a Jew. If I remember correctly, he was a Sadducee. He was from this Jewish leading class. And they saw the new religion of Christianity as a threat. And so people like Paul would travel around as inquisitors, trying to find these so-called Christians and kill them. And so that was his job. And according to his story, he was traveling and he had a vision. And in that vision, he converted and became the Apostle Paul. Again, apostle just means someone who travels or who goes out. Yes, ma'am.
Is this what they mean by history repeats? Because this kind of sounds like World War II with the Jews and Christianity. But it's the other way around.
Yeah, in fact, when we get to anti-Semitism and why people have this, discrimination and hatred toward Jews, part of it has to do with this story. And so we'll come back to that later. But now, so the Apostle Paul converted to Christianity and traveled around the Greek and Roman world. And so if you're very familiar with the New Testament, I'm sure you're aware of the epistles. Those are the letters that Paul wrote to various churches, particularly in the Greek world. So, for example, there's a Greek city-state called Ephesus, hence the book Ephesians. There's one called Corinth, hence the book Corinthians, and so on and so forth. So many of them are named after these churches that he was working with. He was eventually sentenced to death, but as a Roman citizen, he had the opportunity to plead his case, because that was something that Roman law emphasized, is that every Roman citizen is entitled to equal protection under the law. And so even though he was from one of the far distant provinces of Judea, and even though his religion contradicted the established Roman worship of the emperor, and even though he had spent his ministry telling people that the emperor wasn't actually a god, he was still entitled to his day in court. And so many of these letters were written while he was in prison, even telling the story of while he was traveling to have his day in court. So he had his day in court. He appeared before the judiciary, and they sentenced him to death, and they cut his head off. But really, a big part of the reason that Christianity is such an influential religion around the world is anyway, here's his travels. But because of this guy.
Hey, let's have a question more.
So, I know, sweet beard, right? And the luscious locks. Now, this is just one artist rendering. We don't know exactly what he looked like, but he's kind of a big figure in the Christian world, and so lots of particularly medieval European artists have drawn and painted him. So, all right. So now, yeah. So again, there was this disagreement in terms of what some believe the prophet said and what Jesus was. And so many believed that the prophets were referring to a revolutionary warrior, someone who would set them free from Roman occupation. And there was a man called Maccabees, and I can't remember his first name, but he was just known as the Maccabees, who called himself a Messiah. And he said that he had been sent to liberate Judea from Roman occupation. And there were two main revolts called the Maccabees revolts, based on this guy claiming to be the Messiah. And for a small period of time, the Jews pushed out the Romans and won their independence. But if there's one thing in the ancient world that was not tolerated, it was rebellion. And the Roman army marched into Judea and destroyed and burned and dispersed and arrested and murdered. And the last of the revolutionaries fortified themselves on a hilltop called Masad, and they're prepared to fight for the death, settled in for a long siege. So for months, the Romans couldn't take the mountain until eventually they piled up dirt, basket by basket, making an earthen ramp up to the wall. And when they finally broke down the wall, they found that all the Jewish revolutionaries inside had killed themselves rather than face slaughter, imprisonment, or execution. So that was a time known as the diaspora, because while the revolutionaries were all killed, the Romans did not tolerate rebellion. And so they dispersed the Jewish people. They were no longer allowed to live in this province of Judea. And so for nearly 2,000 years, the Jewish people became the largest people group without a home. And so they wandered. And they lived in Europe. They lived around the world, including millions in the United States up until the 1930s. Still a large community here. But then after the Second World War, they got their state back. And now there's the modern state of Israel, which is considered the home of the Jewish people. So, again, from about AD 70 until the Balfour Declaration, literally what it's called, the Balfour Declaration, of about 1945, the Jews had no home, and so they wandered. And so it's the time known as the diaspora, which another Greek word just means they were dispersed. So, meanwhile, there were many Christians among the Roman Empire. And the problem the Romans had with this is very similar to the problem they had with Paul. From the time of Augustus until the time of Constantine, so hundreds of years, the Romans believed that the emperor was a god and had to be worshipped, and anyone who didn't worship him could be punished. But Christians are monotheists, so they didn't believe that the emperor was a god. And so they became enemies of Roman rule. And not only were they enemies and sometimes hunted and sometimes persecuted, but they would often be blamed for bigger problems. And they would be used as scapegoats. And as the peace of Rome began to crumble, Christians were commonly sought out to be crucified, to be burned, or to be killed. And I've got a clip of that to illustrate that I'll show you guys after the lesson. So for now, this is just a carving, an engraving into a stone wall of Roman soldiers carrying off these Jewish relics.
Is that from like that time?
Yeah, so it's a relief. This is a Roman style of art where they would carve into a stone wall.
That's cool.
Yeah, so. Now, Christianity is obviously a global faith. There are over 1 billion Christians in the world today. So it's become a very powerful, very influential religion. And it has widespread appeal.
Why is that, though?
Because.
Why has it grown so greatly? Honestly, Roman history had a lot to do with that. The fact that it was spread throughout the Roman Empire. In fact, the Catholic Church, the Vatican, is still centered in the city of Rome, dating back to the earliest days of the Christian Church.
Also probably because Christianity really doesn't have like certain rules you need to follow,
well, there is rules.
Well, yeah, like the Ten Commandments. But like I mean, like we can eat what we want, basically. But I mean, yeah, it says in the Old Testament that you can't do that, but that was the Old Testament. The New Testament says you can now. But Christianity isn't strict like other religions.
But it was
So
also
more
probably
people
because of
follow them.
colonization, though, because they went to other countries that were Christian. So
Yeah, and there's more to the story. I just put up here a few of the basic teachings, and I, it is not my job to teach a particular faith or to endorse one over another. I'm just trying to look at this as a historian, so we're looking at this as a major global event. Yes, ma'am.
It's 2:03. Can we start working on that?
Yes, so we need to. So otherwise, just by way of closing, Christianity was finally endorsed as at least recognized as a legitimate faith by the Emperor Constantine. To be honest, he really did this because he felt he had no other choice. Constantine once said that Rome is worth a mass, meaning that if I'm going to stay in power, then I need to recognize this faith. And so he was the first emperor to convert to Christianity. But then a later emperor called Theodosius made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Okay,
I want to watch that clip.
we will get to it. Yes.
We
So,
had-
um,
I hope you see what it's going
the early church
You worry me.
was just called the. I don't know if you guys know this, but Catholic just means universal. So the Holy Apostolic Catholic Church is just a reference back to these apostles who set up the church. And Peter was considered the first bishop of Rome, and so all the popes trace back their spiritual lineage to him as the original head of the Christian church. Just a couple more things by way of closing. What we think of as the Bible, which is another Greek word, biblios, which means collection of books. If I remember correctly, it's 54 different books. And so, while the Old Testament had already been well established by the time of Jesus, by the time of the Roman Empire, there was a lot of debate about what should go into the New Testament. And so, in fact, it was a group of Roman religious leaders who made that decision. We'll get to that later. But there were a number of leaders in the early Christian faith from amongst the Roman Empire. For example, the Augustine, who wrote Sadaji de Deus, or the City of God, and stressed the importance of these rituals associated with the Christian faith. So here's what many refer to now as Saint Augustine, who was a bishop from Rome who had his career in ministry in North Africa.